Today, a former nurse faces trial after being accused of multiple baby murders.
Ms. Letby has been preparing for trial. She wants to have her trial.
She spoke once throughout the entirety of the 80-minute hearing.
There has been a massive improvement in her ability to cope.
And that was to confirm her name.
That has been blown away by what has happened.
The defence need to be showing that there are other possible explanations for collapses.
The biggest maternity investigation in NHS history has found yet again services were chronically understaffed and women weren't listened to.
If there's a Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health report identifying major systemic problems during the period in question, this is something that the defence will want to put in evidence. That wasn't allowed.
It just astonished me. I was just amazed. It's blindingly obvious that the obstetric notes would have a bearing upon the health and survivability of neonatal babies going forward. The Crown Prosecution Service say, well, they've asked for this material, we're just not going to give it to them. I'm just astonished as to why that would happen.
The prosecution expert witness was making very categorical statements about matters which really weren't categorical.
I've never known it happen before, that during a live trial, another judge decides to give that information to the judge. Absolutely, it could have collapsed the case.
Not going to go commando on another man's fatigue.
Go commando. You don't understand what that means.
I don't know.
Do justice to yourself. What did you understand go commando to mean?
They diagnosed me with depression and anxiety at that time. I'm unable to sleep without medication.
She tied herself in knots. She struggled when she was cross-examined. I found that was a central part of my assessment.
So it's deliberate poisoning by someone, but not you.
Insulin has been added by somebody. I can't comment on how or who.